The Nexus station hung in the void, like a particularly ostentatious chandelier, its crystalline spires catching starlight from 17 different systems and reflecting it back with the sort of pretentious glow that screamed, "We are very important beings doing very important things," which, to be fair, was exactly the impression the Interstellar Council was going for when they commissioned this monument to bureaucratic excess 3 centuries ago. Inside the main assembly hall, representatives from 412 species sat in their species-appropriate seating arrangements. Some floating in anti-grav bubbles filled with methane, others perched on thermal platforms that would melt lesser beings, and a few suspended in temporal stasis fields, because their consciousness operated on timescales that made watching paint dry seem like a high-speed chase. The air hummed with the constant background noise of universal translators working overtime to convert everything from telepathic harmonics to pheromone-based emotional outbursts into something resembling coherent discourse. At the center of this carefully orchestrated chaos stood the High Coordinator, a being whose species had evolved past the need for a fixed physical form, but somehow still managed to project an aura of supreme condescension. Today's meeting had been called to address what the Council's Department of Existential Cataloging had deemed a critical gap in our understanding of galactic psychology. Esteemed colleagues, the High Coordinator's voice rippled through space-time itself, causing several of the more sensitive species to wince and reach for their dimensional dampeners. We have gathered today to complete the Great Fear Census, a project that will surely rank among our most significant administrative achievements. A low murmur of agreement passed through the assembly, though whether it was genuine enthusiasm or the sort of polite acknowledgement that keeps bureaucratic machinery grinding forward was impossible to determine. The Council had a long and storied history of turning the simple into the impossibly complex, and the Fear Census was shaping up to be a masterpiece of unnecessary complication. The psychological profiles of every member species must be complete, continued the High Coordinator, somehow managing to sound both bored and self-important simultaneously. How can we effectively govern a galaxy when we do not understand what drives each species to their very core, what motivates them, what terrifies them beyond all rational thought? The irony that a council of beings who had never actually governed anything beyond the scheduling of increasingly pointless meetings was attempting to psychoanalyze an entire galaxy was apparently lost on everyone present. Well, almost everyone. In the back corner of the assembly, in a section typically reserved for species considered emerging or quaint, sat the human delegate. The bipedal mammal looked exactly as unremarkable as their species' reputation suggested. Medium height, medium build, medium everything really, with the sort of face that would disappear in a crowd of The only notable thing about them was the way they kept glancing around the assembly hall with an expression that could charitably be called amused and more accurately described as actively trying not to laugh. The High Coordinator's attention turned to the assembled delegates with the theatrical precision of a conductor about to begin a symphony. We shall proceed alphabetically by galactic designation. The Andorian Collective, please state your species' greatest fear. The Andorian representative, a creature that resembled a cross between a jellyfish and a particularly pretentious art installation, pulsed thoughtfully. The degradation of our hive-mind connection. Without unity we cease to be ourselves. Excellent. Most illuminate. The High Coordinator made a note that somehow materialized in the air before dissolving into bureaucratic ether. The Centaurian Republic. Resource depletion, came the immediate response from what looked like a sentient crystal formation. Our homeworld has experienced 3 ice ages due to overconsumption. We fear returning to that darkness. And so it went, species after species providing responses that were logical, predictable, and utterly boring in their reasonableness. The Deltans feared genetic stagnation. The European Confederation worried about their sun going nova. The feline hegemony, and yes, the galaxy really was that unimaginative with names, feared the extinction of their prey species and the subsequent collapse of their ecosystem. Each answer was duly recorded, analyzed, and filed away in the vast bureaucratic machine that kept the Council running. The High Coordinator nodded approvingly at each response, clearly pleased with how neatly everything was fitting into their predetermined category. Fear of death, fear of extinction, fear of environmental collapse. All perfectly rational concerns that could be quantified, studied, and ultimately filed away in the appropriate psychological database. The human delegate sat quietly through it all, occasionally shifting in their seat with what appeared to be growing anticipation. They had declined the offered atmospheric modifications, breathing the station's standard mixture with no apparent difficulty, and had turned down the neural interface that would have allowed them to participate in the Council's collective consciousness. Thanks, but we prefer to keep our thoughts to ourselves, had been their polite but firm response. As the alphabetical progression continued through species whose names ranged from the merely unpronounceable to the actively hostile to most vocal chords, a pattern emerged that was so consistent it bordered on the tedious. Every fear was external, environmental, or existential in the grand cosmic sense. These were civilizations that had achieved interstellar travel, mastered energy manipulation on planetary scales, and developed technologies that bent space-time to their will, yet their deepest fears remained refreshingly straightforward. The Jovian gas dancers feared atmospheric storms that could disrupt their aerial cities. The Nebulan Collective worried about dark matter interactions affecting their energy-based physiology. The Ophiuchi Assembly dreaded the heat death of the universe and the eventual cessation of all stellar formation. All very reasonable, all very predictable, all very... The High Coordinator was clearly in their element, watching their grand census unfold exactly as their carefully constructed models had predicted. The galaxy was proving to be a remarkably orderly place, filled with rational beings who feared rational things for rational reasons. It was the sort of discovery that would generate years of academic papers, interdisciplinary conferences, and the kind of peer recognition that made the Council's existence feel justified. As the list progressed into species whose names started with letters that hurt most beings' minds to contemplate, the Assembly began to take on the comfortable rhythm of a well-orchestrated administrative procedure. Questions asked, answers given, forms filed, boxes checked. The great machinery of galactic bureaucracy operating exactly as designed. The human delegate continued to wait patiently, though their expression had shifted to something that experienced observers of their species might have recognized as barely contained mirth. They had been taking notes throughout the proceedings, though what exactly they found worth recording about such straightforward responses remained unclear. Finally, inevitably, the alphabetical progression reached its conclusion with the Zetari Enclave, who feared the collapse of their multi-dimensional pocket universe, and the Xiphonian Empire, whose greatest terror was the thought of their carefully maintained caste system falling into chaos. The High Coordinator paused, reviewing their notes with obvious satisfaction. 410 species surveyed, 410 perfectly reasonable fears catalogued and filed. The Great Fear Census was proving to be exactly the sort of orderly, predictable success that would cement their reputation as the galaxy's foremost experts on interspecies psychology. And that brings us, the High Coordinator announced, their voice carrying just the slightest hint of weary condescension, to our final entry, the human delegation from the Sol system. The temperature in the assembly hall seemed to drop by several degrees, though whether this was due to the climate control systems, or the collective attention of 411 alien species focusing on a single unremarkable biped was difficult to determine. The human delegates stood slowly, straightening their simple gray clothing with the sort of careful precision that suggested they were about to say something important. Around the hall, representatives leaned forward in their various seating arrangements, curious to hear what this newcomer species, barely a century into interstellar travel and still struggling with basic energy manipulation, could possibly contribute to such an august gathering. After all, what could a species that still used chemical propulsion and linear thinking possibly fear that would be of interest to civilizations that had mastered faster-than-light travel and multi-dimensional physics? The question hung in the air like a challenge, waiting for an answer that everyone assumed would be as mundane and predictable as all the others. They were about to discover just how wrong that assumption was. The human delegate cleared their throat, a curiously primitive sound that somehow managed to cut through the sophisticated ambient hum of 411 different life support systems. Several species who communicated primarily through biochemical exchanges found the noise oddly unsettling, though they couldn't quite articulate why. "Thank you, High Coordinator," the human said, their voice carrying none of the formal harmonics or dimensional undertones that typically marked important pronouncements in council chambers. Just plain linear audio waves propagating through atmosphere like some sort of antique communication method. "We appreciate being included in this comprehensive survey. The High Coordinator's form shifted slightly, which observers had learned to interpret as the equivalent of an impatient gesture. Indeed, now, if you would simply state your species' primary fear for our records, we can conclude this historic sense. Around the hall, representatives settled back into their various resting positions. The crystalline hegemony dimmed their internal luminescence to conserve energy. The gaseous collective reduced their molecular excitement to a barely perceptible vibration. Even the notoriously hyperactive quantum dancers slowed their probability fluctuations to something approaching stillness. Everyone was ready for this tedious exercise to reach its predictable conclusion. The human looked around the assembly with that same barely contained amusement, as if they were viewing some elaborate performance put on for their entertainment. Well, that's an interesting question. What do humans fear most? They paused, appearing to consider their words carefully. I suppose the honest answer would be ourselves. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable quiet of a completed task. It was the sort of silence that happens when a universal translator encounters something so unexpected that it briefly considers the possibility that it might be malfunctioning. Several representatives actually checked their translation matrices, certain they had misheard. I'm sorry, the High Coordinator said, their form flickering with what might have been confusion. Could you clarify that response? Our records show that humans are a social species. Surely you don't fear social isolation or abandonment? Oh no, the human replied, their tone remaining conversational, almost casual. We fear what we're capable of doing, to each other, to ourselves, to anyone or anything that gets in our way when we're sufficiently motivated. The Andorian collective pulsed uneasily, their hive mind connection carrying ripples of something that wasn't quite concern but wasn't comfort either. The Centaurian crystals began to emit a barely audible harmonic that their species typically reserved for processing particularly complex mathematical paradox. But surely, interjected the representative from the peaceful communion of evolved beings, a species whose name was exactly as pretentious as it sounded, you must fear some external threat, cosmic radiation, asteroid impacts, the eventual heat death of the universe. The humans shook their head, and the simple gesture somehow carried more weight than it should have. Those are things that might kill us. We fear what we might do while we're still alive. A nervous murmur began to circulate through the assembly, translated into everything from subsonic vibrations to quantum entanglement fluctuations. The feline hegemony's representative actually hissed, though whether from confusion or some deeper instinctive reaction was unclear. Perhaps, suggested the High Coordinator with the sort of strained patience typically reserved for dealing with particularly slow students, you could provide a more specific example. What particular aspect of your own species generates this self-directed apprehension? The human's expression shifted to something that observers might have mistaken for sadness if they didn't notice the underlying steel in their eyes. We fear our capacity for violence, not just physical violence, though we're quite good at that. We fear our ability to turn anything science, art, love, even hope into a weapon. We fear that there might not be anything we won't destroy if we convince ourselves we have good enough reason. The temperature in the assembly hall actually did drop this time, as several species' metabolic processes slowed in response to what their primitive survival instincts were interpreting as a predator declaration. The fact that most of these species had evolved past such crude threat recognition systems millions of years ago made their unconscious reactions all the more disturbing. That the High Coordinator began, then paused, apparently struggling with concepts that their advanced civilization had never needed to develop language for. That's not fear. That's awareness of capability. Exactly, the human said, and their smile was somehow more unsettling than any threat display in the Council's extensive xenopsychological databases. We're afraid because we know exactly what we're capable of, and the truly terrifying part, we're not even close to our limits. The European Confederation's representative, a being of pure mathematical logic, spoke up with the sort of precision that comes from processing reality through quantum computers. By your own admission, this self-awareness should serve as a limiting factor. Surely knowledge of one's destructive potential would encourage restraint. The human's laugh was brief and contained absolutely no humor. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the thing about humans. We have this remarkable ability to convince ourselves that this time is different, that this cause is just, that this enemy is so terrible that any response is justified. We fear ourselves because we know that our greatest atrocities are always committed by people who genuinely believed they were saving the world. The assembly was now actively uncomfortable in ways that transcended species barriers.
Beings who hadn't experienced anything resembling anxiety in geological ages found themselves checking their personal defense systems. Others began calculating the distance to the nearest exit portals. The High Coordinator's form had taken on a distinctly agitated configuration. Surely this is an exaggeration. Your species has achieved interstellar travel. You've developed cooperative protocols sufficient to join galactic society. These achievements require considerable social stability and ethical development. Oh, we can cooperate, the human agreed cheerfully. We're actually quite good at it, especially when we have a common enemy. The scariest thing about humans isn't that we fight each other, it's how effectively we can work together when we decide something needs to be destroyed. The statement hung in the recycled atmosphere like a toxic cloud. Several species were now actively reviewing their homeworld's defensive capabilities, while others found themselves wondering if perhaps the Council's traditional policy of admitting new species with minimal background checks might need revision. The human looked around the assembly with that same mild amusement, apparently unaware of, or perhaps entirely comfortable with the growing sense of unease their words had created. "Don't worry," they added helpfully. "We're mostly afraid of ourselves. The rest of you are probably safe." The word probably echoed through 411 different nervous systems with all the comfort of a neutron star collision. And in that moment, the Great Fear Census had recorded its most honest entry. A species that didn't fear the universe, but rather what they might do to.
The aftermath of the humans' declaration settled over the assembly like radiation from a dying star. Invisible, but with the distinct sensation that something fundamental had been altered at the molecular level. The High Coordinator's form had stabilized into what xenopsychologists would later describe as aggressive contemplation. While around the hall, representatives engaged in the sort of urgent whispering that accompanies the realization that someone has just said something deeply important and possibly catastrophic. "Surely," ventured the delegate from the Rational Enlightenment Coalition, "a species whose evolutionary path had led them to abandon all emotions except mild intellectual curiosity. This self-assessment is somewhat dramatized. Most sapient species experience occasional intraspecies conflict during their development phases." The human tilted their head with the sort of patronizing patience typically reserved for explaining basic physics to particularly dim children. "Oh, we're well past the development phase. We've been having wars for our entire recorded history. We've gotten quite good at them, actually. We even had a period where we stockpiled enough weapons to sterilize our entire planet several times over, just in case once wasn't enough." A collective shudder passed through the assembly, literally collective in the case of the hive-minded species, and uncomfortably metaphorical for everyone else. The Peaceful Communion's representative began emitting stress pheromones so potent that nearby delegates started checking their air filtration systems. "But that's impossible," protested the crystalline hegemony's spokesman, their internal structure flickering with agitation. "No rational species would develop omnicide capabilities. The risk-reward calculations alone would prevent such madness." "Rational," the human repeated, savoring the word like a fine vintage of irony. "That's your first mistake. We didn't build those weapons because it was rational. We built them because the other humans were building them, and we couldn't let them have more apocalypse than we did. It was perfectly logical in a completely insane sort of way." The High Coordinator had been conducting urgent background searches through the Council's databases, and their form was beginning to take on the sort of configuration typically associated with beings who've just discovered something they wish they could undiscover. "Our preliminary surveys of your species indicated standard technological development patterns. Agricultural revolution, industrial advancement, space exploration. Nothing in our data suggests." "Suggests what?" the human asked, innocent. "That we've been systematically perfecting the art of killing each other for millennia. That we've turned warfare into a science so sophisticated that we have academic institutions dedicated to studying more effective ways to end life. That we've weaponized everything from bacteria to mathematics to interpretive dance." The last item caused a brief moment of confusion, until several species simultaneously realized that if humans could weaponize interpretive dance, they probably shouldn't ask for detail. "The Galactic Accords," stammered the representative from the benevolent unity of harmonious worlds, "clearly state that species seeking membership must demonstrate peaceful intentions and cooperative capabilities. The human smile could have been used to cut through reinforced durasteel. Oh, we are cooperative. We work together beautifully when we have a common goal. The problem is that our common goals tend to involve removing obstacles, and we have a very broad definition of what constitutes an obstacle. Emergency consultations were now occurring throughout the assembly hall in every communication method the galaxy had catalogued, and several that probably violated local physics laws. The quantum dancers had accelerated their probability fluctuations to near panic levels, while the temporal collective had actually retreated several microseconds into the past to buy time for processing. This must be some form of species-wide psychological disorder, declared the Mental Health Monitoring Board's representative. A being whose species had evolved past individual consciousness into a state of perpetual group therapy. Perhaps we could recommend treatment options. Treatment. The human's laugh contained enough dark amusement to power a small star. We've tried that. We have thousands of years of philosophy, religion, and psychology all dedicated to making us better people. They work too, right up until we decide that this particular situation is special enough to make exception. The High Coordinator's desperate search through historical databases had apparently yielded results, because their form was now flickering between configurations with the sort of rapid cycling that indicated severe computational stress. Your species application file there is significant omissions. The section on historical conflicts is listed as too extensive for standard documentation. Well, you did say to keep the paperwork brief, the human replied cheerfully. We didn't want to bore you with detail, though I suppose we could have mentioned that one time we had a war that lasted 30 years over religious differences, or the century where we killed 100 million people because we couldn't agree on economic system. The atmosphere in the assembly hall had progressed beyond uncomfortable and was now actively hostile to most forms of life. Several species were conducting discrete scans of their escort vessels, while others had begun calculating jump coordinates back to their home system. These numbers, the High Coordinator's voice carried the sort of hollow tone reserved for beings confronting mathematical impossibilities. Our models indicate that conflicts of such magnitude would result in civilization collapse or species extinction. Oh, they nearly did, the human agreed with the casual tone of someone discussing weather patterns. Several times actually. But here's the thing about humans: we're remarkably good at rebuilding. And every time we rebuild, we get better at it. More efficient, more organized, more thorough. The word thorough seemed to echo with implications that made even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy suddenly very interested in reviewing their defense budgets. But surely, the evolved being's representative said with the sort of desperate optimism that clings to rationality even as it circles the drain. Your species has moved beyond such primitive behavior. You've achieved spaceflight, developed interstellar communication, joined galactic society. Actually, the human interrupted. We achieved spaceflight because we wanted to build better missiles. Our first satellites were launched on repurposed weapons. We reached our moon using technology originally designed to deliver nuclear warheads to other continents. And we joined galactic society because, well, they paused, looking around the assembly hall with fresh appreciation. This is quite an impressive collection of civilizations you've got here. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable. It was the sort of silence that happens when an entire galaxy simultaneously realizes it might have made a terrible mistake. The human continued with the same helpful tone one might use to explain a recipe. The really fascinating part is how we always manage to convince ourselves we're the good guys. Every war, every atrocity, every act of systematic destruction, we do it all in the name of peace, justice, freedom, or some other noble ideal. We're probably the only species in the galaxy that commits genocide for humanitarian reasons. And with that statement, the Great Fear Census had not only catalogued what humans feared most, it had given the rest of the galaxy something new to be afraid of. The assembly hall had transformed into something resembling a support group for civilizations having existential crises. Emergency protocols were being activated across 411 different command structures,
while diplomatic channels buzzed with the sort of frantic communications typically reserved for imminent stellar collapse or the discovery of universe-ending paradoxes. The High Coordinator had abandoned all pretense of maintaining their sophisticated energy form and had collapsed into what could charitably be described as a very expensive pile of glowing anxiety. Emergency session, they managed to broadcast, their voice carrying the sort of tremor that suggested even beings evolved past physical form could experience something uncomfortably similar to panic. All delegates are to remain in chambers while we process this information. The human delegate, apparently oblivious to the galactic nervous breakdown they'd precipitated, had settled back into their chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just successfully explained a particularly complex concept to a slow student. They even had the audacity to look pleased with themselves. "If I may," spoke the representative from the ancient philosophical circle, a species so old they remembered when the galaxy was still organizing itself into coherent matter. "Perhaps we are overreacting. Many species experience aggressive phases during their evolutionary development. Surely humans will eventually transcend these tendencies." The human's expression shifted to something that experienced negotiators might have recognized as the look someone gets right before they deliver news that will ruin everyone's day. "Oh, we have transcended them. We've turned them into art form. We've industrialized warfare, mechanized suffering, and automated destruction. We've taken our most primitive instincts and enhanced them with technology that can bend space-time." A collective shudder ran through the assembly that registered on several nearby seismic monitors. The crystalline hegemony began emitting harmonics that their species typically reserved for mourning extinct civilizations. But the Galactic Peace Accords, protested the benevolent unity's representative with the sort of desperate hope that clings to bureaucracy even as reality burns around. "You signed them. You agreed to the non-aggression principles, the mutual defense clauses, the cooperative exploration mandates." "Oh, we're excellent at signing agreements," the human replied with the sort of cheerful enthusiasm that made everyone in the hall unconsciously lean away from them. "We have thousands of years of experience with treaties, accords, conventions, and compacts. We've signed agreements to end wars, prevent wars, limit wars, and make wars more polite. The trick is in the interpretation." The High Coordinator's form had stabilized enough to project something resembling authority, though it flickered with the sort of instability that suggested they were running multiple crisis management protocols simultaneously. "Are you suggesting that your species entered galactic society with ulterior motives?" The human appeared to consider this question with the same careful attention one might give to selecting lunch from a particularly appealing menu. "I wouldn't say ulterior, more like comprehensive. We've always believed in being thorough in our endeavor." Emergency consultations were now occurring at frequencies that were causing interference with local communication networks. Several species had begun discreet evacuations of their non-essential personnel, while others were reviewing their homeworld's defensive capabilities with the sort of urgency typically reserved for incoming asteroid swarm. "The technology sharing agreements," whispered the Rational Enlightenment Coalition's representative, their voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd just realized they'd been walking through a minefield while juggling active grenades. "We've been providing humans with advanced weapons technology, faster-than-light capabilities, energy manipulation systems, and we're very grateful," the human interjected with the sort of politeness that somehow made the words sound like a threat. "We've learned so much. Did you know that your quantum displacement drives can be modified to create localized space-time distortions, fascinating applications for area denial, and those dimensional phase generators, remarkable penetration capabilities against traditional shielding systems?" The temporal collective actually attempted to retreat further into the past, but discovered that their time manipulation abilities were being dampened by what appeared to be universe-wide causality locks, a phenomenon that shouldn't have been possible, and suggested that someone with access to extremely advanced temporal technology was ensuring this conversation remained linear and unavoidable. "The research partnerships," groaned the Scientific Advancement Bureau's delegate, a being whose species had dedicated their entire civilization to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. "We've been collaborating with humans on theoretical physics, exotic matter research, consciousness transfer technology, wonderful programs," the human agreed warmly. we've made remarkable progress, particularly in the field of applied psychology and mass behavior modification. Your species' research into collective consciousness manipulation has been enlightening. The realization was spreading through the assembly like a plague specifically designed to target the higher functions of advanced civilizations. 411 species, representing the most sophisticated, peaceful, and enlightened cultures in the galaxy, was simultaneously discovering that they had spent decades enthusiastically providing weapons, technology, and strategic information to what was beginning to appear to be the most dangerous predator species in known space. But your application documents, the High Coordinator said with the sort of desperate precision that comes from clutching at bureaucratic straws while drowning in an ocean of implications. Your species was classified as emerging and benign, low threat assessment, minimal defensive capabilities. The human smile could have been used as a textbook illustration of the concept of ominous. While we did have minimal defensive capabilities, we were much more focused on offensive research. And as for benign, they paused, appearing to savor the word. I suppose that depends on your definition. We're perfectly harmless to anyone who doesn't present an obstacle to our goals. And what? Asked the ancient philosophical circle's representative with the sort of careful enunciation that comes from asking questions you desperately don't want answered. Are those goals? The humans stood slowly, straightening their simple gray clothing, with the same careful precision they'd displayed at the beginning of this catastrophic census. Around the hall, 411 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations held their collective breath, waiting for an answer that they somehow knew was going to change everything. Oh, the usual, the human replied with casual cheerfulness that would haunt galactic nightmares for centuries to come. We want to make the universe a better place. For humans, of course, we're very civic-minded that way. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was the sort of silence that happens when an entire galaxy simultaneously realizes that it has been magnificently, comprehensively, and possibly irreversibly outplayed. And as the human delegate gathered their simple notes and prepared to leave the assembly hall, the Great Fear Census finally had its complete data set. 410 species who feared extinction, environmental collapse or cosmic catastrophe, all external threats that could be calculated, predicted, and potentially avoided, and one species that feared itself, but had decided to become everyone else's problem instead. The High Coordinator's final entry in the census records would later become required reading in xenopsychology programs across the galaxy. Recommendation: some questions should never be asked, some answers should never be given, some species should never be admitted to galactic society without considerably more thorough background checks. But by then, of course, it was far too late for such insights to be anything more than a very expensive lesson in the importance of reading the fine print, especially when the fine print is written by a species that considers the entire universe to be a rough draft in need of substantial editing.